about justice. It says in our Torah that we are constantly supposed to be thinking about justice. And in fact, in this week's Parsha specifically, it says, "You shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes in all the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice. You shall not judge unfairly. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea for the justice." And this probably we have heard many, many, many times before. Justice, justice shall you pursue. The exciting part for me when I was reading this in preparation for this discussion this evening was it wasn't just that you are supposed to appoint for yourselves magistrates and officials for your tribes, but I'd like to posit this idea out for all of us that there are times when we need to appoint ourselves as judges, or maybe we find out that we are judges in our own lives. In fact, if we think about how we actually engage in thought, many times we actually are judges in our own lives. We just may not necessarily want to admit because, we want to think that we're kind, compassionate, loving, all these wonderful things. But the truth is sometimes we can be a little bit judgmental. And that should be expected. After all, that's kind of how we think. One of the amazing things by Dr. Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work in the very field of expressing how do we think and therefore how do we judge? And are we able collectively to judge other people with no partiality? The truth is that kind of based on how we think, that's a challenge for us. It is so hard to be impartial, but we have to ask why. Well, according to him and his theory, there are two systems running concurrently in our minds when we think and engage in choices. The first system he teaches is one that happens automatically, intuitively. We don't even think about it. We just think fast. We drive cars. We recall certain things almost automatically, responsively, intuitively. The second system uses problem solving, concentration. We think slow. We use logic. Now, the problem is that sometimes we're not even aware of which system we're actually using. When we look at somebody who's standing before us and they happen to have a specific appearance, are we judging them with system one? Are we judging them automatically, almost without even thinking? Or are we judging them with system two, where we're thinking and we're engaging and we are present in the moment? I want us to think even more so, because he goes even deeper into this. How do we judge? Well, let's think. One of the ways that we will do is we'll kind of form a narrative, and especially if we are in system one of judgment, now this might sound familiar to some of you, we will look for facts to support where we are in our position. Sound familiar? We may have a little bit of bias occurring. Whereas when we're engaged in system two in our brain of logic and reason, we will attempt to discern what's happening before us. Maybe when we're in system one, we might just go down a rabbit hole in Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, finding evidence supporting what we'd like. Whereas system two, we may simply be unaware that, we may simply really need to research and look. How does this or respond in our lives as a Jewish community? There was an article that came out in the foreword where they expressed a study of individual Jews who identified themselves as Jews of color. They analyzed 1,118 individuals who were interviewed both online and via survey. And I know this is shocking, but when asked, 8 in 10 of them experienced some form of discrimination in the Jewish community. part of that, I think, is because oftentimes we will find ourselves thinking in system one. We will just think about, what does a Jew look like? Kind of like an Ashkenazic look to them. And we won't necessarily identify that there are others. This bias also happens, and the craziest part about it is that we don't even realize that we're doing it half the time. We are just inherently being either warm and welcoming, or we're holding up a door, and it may be subconscious. The respondents, 66% of them identified as biracial, mixed, or multiracial, and of those, 64 had at least one Jewish parent, 22% had two Jewish parents, and only 40% of them were Jews by choice. So if we think about it and recognize that Jews of color in America today, just like the release of the census study, they are more diverse from more backgrounds, and we recognize and see that sometimes our bias, our system one thought, can prevent them from feeling totally warm and welcome. It's up to us to choose how we engage once we become aware of a specific issue. It's up to us to choose to be impartial and to really want to be warm and welcoming. And to do so, that takes a lot of intention, that takes a lot of focus, when in fact, it's hard to do. We don't want to necessarily think that we're kind of closed off and in a bubble, but the truth is oftentimes we are. And so I'd like to bring Daniel Kahneman's work to the spotlight to help think of a path through our inherent biases, not just around any issue of race, but you can pick a controversial subject matter today and recognize that there are times when we allow our biases to override our major decision-making skills, and we allow our preconceptions to prevent us from really making decisions based on logic. And this is an opportunity to allow ourselves not to do that, but to really be at the forefront of our minds and use logic and reason to go forward. As we live in scary times, may awareness of how we think drive us to live out the verse of not just encouraging the creation of magistrates and officials who will judge with no partiality, but may it encourage us as a community and as a nation to judge each other and support each other without partiality and uplift one another. Can you hear Ratzon? May this be God's will.